Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Determinate Content. Today, I'm joined by Jamin Asay, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy at Purdue University. And he's the author of the Primitivist Theory of Truth, a Theory of Truthmaking, and also recently Cambridge Element on Truthmaking. And today, we will be discussing his 2013 article, Truthmaking, Metaethics, and Creeping Minimalism. But before we get into that, I just wanted to ask you if you could introduce yourself in more depth, and also if you would like to say something about like why you think philosophy and maybe also metaphysics is worth pursuing.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. So yeah, my name is Jamin Asay. I'm currently Associate Professor of Philosophy at Purdue University. This is my first year here in Purdue. I've been spending the last decade working in Hong Kong, first at Lingnan University, then at the University of Hong Kong. So I've recently done a major move. And in terms of my philosophical background, I think of myself as someone who works in metaphysics and then philosophy of language and philosophy of science. But most of my work has some connection back to the topic of truth, and which I think is a good topic to be interested in if you have broad interests in philosophy, because I think truth touches on all fields of philosophy, really. And so my work in the philosophy of language and metaphysics and philosophy of science often relates back to truth in some way and the role that truth plays or doesn't play in those domains. But I do often think of myself first and foremost as a metaphysician. And I think something that's behind that is I do think, in a sense, I'm a kind of a inevitabilist about metaphysics. I think metaphysics is something that all of us actually end up doing, regardless of our theoretical interests. I think metaphysics touches on every discipline in the philosophy and the sciences and every other academic endeavor. So I feel like there's no getting rid of metaphysics. I think it's an indispensable component of human thought. So I think no matter, I'm just one of those people who thinks any attempt to get rid of metaphysics is just another attempt to articulate a different approach to what metaphysics is. So I think it's always there. And then so my approach is to say, well, given that metaphysics is something we have to do, what's the best way to go about doing it, and what's the right way to think about it, and how it shows up in other areas of philosophy. So this is why I think maybe one reason I was attracted to truth-making, because I think the idea behind truth-making is that it's a metaphysical idea, but it applies in every domain. You can ask truth-making questions about any domain where you think there's any truth or falsity to be found. And that, I think, brings out the point that no matter what domain of knowledge or thought we're talking about an area where we can ask questions about truth-making, which is to say we can ask questions about metaphysics. So I think metaphysics is there in every discipline. And what I like about truth-maker theory is that it brings that to the surface and says, here are some metaphysical questions that need to be asked about this domain if we do care about the metaphysics behind that domain.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for that. I was just that's a really good segue to the questions I have, because your article is titled Truthmaking, Metaethics, and Creeping Minimalism. And I thought a very straightforward way to get into that is just to ask of each part of that title, what they are. So could you just explain for someone who hasn't heard of the notion before, like what is truth-making? And also maybe go into your specific, because I know you have some specific views on how we should view truth-making and questions about truth-making.
Yeah, so this paper, it applies my broader thinking about truth-making to a specific problem inside the domain of metaethics. So it's a kind of a rehearsal of that bigger picture perspective I was just talking about. Here's this metaphysical question, we can bring it to bear on an issue in ethics, and in a way that hopefully makes some progress on a standing ethical philosophical issue there. So truth-making, you can start there. So I think the way most people would start to talk about truth-making is with the idea that when you've got something true, whether that be a belief, a sentence, proposition, whatever you take to be the bearers of truth in the world, that truth isn't some fundamental piece of reality. That proposition or sentence is true because of what's typically going on independently of that sentence. It's going on in virtue of what's going on in the world. So when you have something that's true, first pass of truth making theory is saying, well, when something's true, it's true in virtue of something going on in reality. It's true in virtue of the world, true in virtue of what exists out there in the world. Something like that, I think, is a starting point. And another way to think about it is that it's a kind of euthyphro contrast. So you can take a sentence. So you see this example back in Aristotle. Even Aristotle says, take a sentence like, a person exists. And Aristotle says, you can ask this question. You can say, okay, well, on the one hand, we have this true sentence or true belief. A person exists. On the other hand, we have a particular person. And we can say, well, and first realize that the truth and existence of these things go together. If there were no people, the sentence, there are people, would not be true. And anytime you've got the true sentence, there are people, there's going to be in the world things that exist, people. But Aristotle says we can still ask this further question. Is the sentence true because of the person, or does the person exist because the sentence is true? And I think most people, when they hear that, think, well, the right euthyphro answer here is, well, the sentence is true because of the thing out there in the world. The world comes first, in other words, and because the world's there, that determines which sentences and beliefs are true or false. So the true beliefs about the truth of our beliefs depends on what's going on there out in the world. And so I think truthmaker theory starts from that idea and says, okay, well, that's a way that what we believe to be true and our views about ontology and metaphysics need to be coordinated in the right way. And so to think about truth making is to think about, well, given what we take to be true, what does there need to be in reality that would offer the right kind of metaphysical support or whatever for those things that we take to be true? So there can be very basic examples like that one from Aristotle, where you've got like a person exists, and then you got the person. If a person exists, that could make it true that there are people. No surprise there. But then things get tricky pretty quickly. You can think about counterfactual conditionals. So if I were to take this piece of plastic here, if I were to release it and drop it to the ground, if I were to release the piece of plastic, it would fall down to the ground. So that's a counterfactual. I didn't actually release it, but it still seems like if I had released it, it would have fallen down. That's something true about the world. So, but in virtue of what is it true? There was no event of me dropping it down. But that's not just some like basic metaphysical fact about reality. That's true because of what's going on in the world. So like, what does there actually need to be in the world to explain why when I drop this, it's going to fall down? Why it would fall down were I to drop it. So I think truth-making questions can start off with very simple examples, but very quickly, it's not at all obvious what the right metaphysical question is. So that's what truthmaker theory is saying, well, take the truths in some particular domain that you're interested in. And now let's think really hard about the right kind of ontology that would be appropriate there. So I see the project of truthmaker theory as trying to give an account of, well, in the first place, what is this truth-making relation that we're talking about here? If I say, here's a sentence, here's a thing, and the thing is a truth maker for that sentence, I'm positing this relationship between the two. And so one job of truth maker theory is to give a articulation or theory about what that relation is supposed to be. And then another big question here is going to be, well, how widely applicable is this relation? Does every truth have a truth maker? I think it's an open question within truthmaker theory whether every truth has or needs a truth maker. That's called truthmaker maximalism. Or if it's open that there are some truths out there that don't actually require truth makers. So that's something we could certainly talk about later. There are interesting potential counterexamples to the thesis that every truth needs a truth maker. So we need to talk about which truths need truth makers, what this truth making relation actually is. And then we need to talk about, well, what are the truth makers? Now let's go do some metaphysics and say, well, thinking about truth making leads me to think this is the right ontological story for this domain of truths. So that's how I see the broader picture of truth making.
Yeah. Right. And in this article, you take this broader picture and you apply it to a particular problem in metaethics, which is known as creeping minimalism. So I was just wondering if you could just give, because this problem is, I don't think, very widely known outside of the confines of technical philosophy. So I was just wondering if you could give like an elevator pitch as to what this problem actually, why this matters, why this problem matters, and what it is.
Yeah, so it's so this problem, creeping minimalism, it's thought to be a problem for metaethics, which is to say, if you are interested in asking philosophical questions about the nature of our ethical thinking, this problem arises for you potentially. So if you're interested in metaethics, then you're interested not just in what's right or wrong and like action, advice about what you should actually do with your life and how you should treat others, but you're interested in what is it to be an ethical creature like we are? What is it to have a thought about ethics? What is to have knowledge in the ethical domain? What is it about reality that could make our ethical claims true or false, if indeed they are true or false? Asking those questions makes you a metaethicist. And so if you think those questions are important, you think that's important to have a better understanding of what it is that we are all collectively doing when we engage in ethical thought, ethical language, ethical action. So that's what it is to be a metaethicist. And so, but if you're a metaethicist, then there is this big question that's been lurking over, I guess it's been about maybe 20 years now since the Dreyer wrote the first paper. So there is this long-standing debate within metaethics about, well, what are we doing when we make a moral judgment? So when I say something like torture is bad, two very big high-level perspectives are, on the one hand, I'm making some claim about the way the world really is. The world really has moral features to it. Things really are right. Things really are wrong. And when I say torture is wrong, I'm taking a stand on that. I'm saying, look, this kind of action is something that actually has moral wrongness to it. And that's as true and objective a claim as anything else you might say about the world. On the other side is this group that says, well, it's not quite clear how that kind of claim could really be describing reality. It's unclear how you would know about these properties of rightness or wrongness. That seems to not fit very well into our scientific worldview. Maybe the better way to understand what we're doing when we make these moral judgments is actually expressing our emotions or expressing our sentiments. We're not describing reality correctly. What we're doing is we're emoting. We are communicating to the world that we disapprove of certain actions or approve of certain actions. We're not reporting that. We're not saying, I don't like this. When I say torture is wrong, I'm not literally saying I don't like torture. My dislike of torture makes my utterance sincere. But what I'm saying when I say torture is bad, I'm kind of saying thumbs down to torturing people. That's, but that to say, thumbs down to something is not to say something about the world. It's just to express my preference in these matters or my emotions or sentiments. So it's not something that's properly true or false. So with the problem of creeping minimalism says, well, we can just focus for now on truth, because that's how I set it up here. So like on one side, there's this more realistic perspective that says moral judgments are just as true and false as anything else. On the other side is this emotivist, non-cognitivist tradition that says these claims aren't in the business of truth or falsity whatsoever. Because if they were true, they'd have to be describing reality, and we don't think there's moral properties and stuff to correspond to them. So the next stage is to say, well, maybe we're thinking about just the nature of truth wrong in all of this. Maybe we're thinking truth is too much of a metaphysical notion. If we're a so-called minimalist about truth, then we don't think what it is to be true is to correspond with reality in some very official or specific way. A minimalist about truth says the philosophy of truth is really quite simple. What it is to say that something is true is effectively just to assert that thing all over again. So if I say it's true that snow is white, all I've really said there, according to the minimalist, is that snow is white. The ground order claim and the claim that ascribes truth to it are basically the same claim. There's no important substantive metaphysical difference there. So if you have that perspective on truth, then anything you're willing to assert, if you're willing to assert that the chair is red, then you can equally assert that it's true that the chair is red, or that the sentence, the chair is red, is true. Because attributing truth is really no more than just making the original ground level attribution. So now apply that thought to ethical domains. If you're willing to say, look, torture is wrong, then given if you're a minimalist about truth, you should equally be happy to say, oh, well, it's true that torture is wrong. If you're willing to say that giving to charity is good, then you should be willing to say it's true that giving to charity is good. Because in applying truth to it, you're just restating the same thing you did in the first place. So there shouldn't be this reluctance to deny that ethical judgments can be true or false if you are happy to be a minimalist about truth. So if you take that on board, now the question is, how do we actually separate these two supposedly big camps that seem to be different? You've got one camp that says ethical judgments are true or false, and the other one says they're not true or false at all. But if you're a minimalist about truth, then it seems like if you're on this side, you should be happy to say, yeah, I guess they're just as true or false, because when we're adding true or falsity, we're not really adding any more substance to our claims. So both camps should now be happy to say, yeah, if torture is wrong, then it's true that torture is wrong. And so the attempt to separate these two views by saying one thinks that moral claims are true or false, the other camp thinks they're neither, that breaks down if you're a minimalist. Now both camps are happy to agree. So the idea is, if you're a minimalist about truth, we've lost one way to articulate this supposedly important substantive fundamental difference between these two metaethical perspectives. We thought there was this big divide between these two big pictures about what we're doing in ethical thought and language. But this other philosophical view that we might be committed to for whatever reason suggests that contrast is no longer so big. So then what happens is you think, well, if it's not about truth, that's not what separates the two camps. It's actually one camp thinks they express propositions, the other camp thinks they don't express propositions. But then if you're a minimalist about propositions, then you say, like, well, as long as you're willing to say something that has a truth valued form, you can talk about propositions. Like, let's just talk about propositions as a way of speaking, not as like a commitment to these entities. Right. And so if you're a minimalist about propositions, that can no longer draw the contrast. So then you got to reach for some other philosophical notion to say, here's what the realists believe in that the non-realists don't believe in. But if you go minimalist about that, then you lose that tool. So the creeping minimalism says, like, once you're willing to travel down these roads, then you're going to lose the ability to distinguish between these two perspectives.
Right. And so, okay, so now we know a little bit about truth making. We know a little bit about creeping minimalism. And in your essay, you're trying to use truth making as a way of distinguishing realism from expressivism or quasi-realism about some domain of discourse, maybe moral about moral utterances or modal utterances, so on. But I was just wondering, so you dismiss some strategies in the front, and from the start. So one is this bifurcationist strategy of saying that there are some truths, but some of them are really true. So I think Kit Fine has adopted an approach, something like that. So it's just, but you kind of dismiss that because you say that a minimalist would equally kind of disagree with such a move, because that would put an ambiguity into truth. Maybe I was wondering, does that kind of have any bearing on your like primitivist view on truth? Like do you have like a positive argument against that view, or is it just mainly from the point of view of a minimalist themselves of putting such a bifurcation between like what is true and what is really true?
Yeah, so the dialectic with the creeping minimalism problem is generally like, well, once you start down the minimalist path, how do you stop it in a way that lets you preserve this supposedly important metaethical disagreement? So the argument that I make in the paper against the bifurcation view, so the bifurcation view says, well, let's grant that let's keep these tools, but we'll double them up. There's two different versions of each of them. And what's going on with the quasi-realist, expressivist, anti-realist camp is they're using the weak version of all that stuff. And the other camp is using the strong version of all that stuff. So that's a way of saying, let the minimalists go down their minimalist path. They can do that if they want. But that doesn't cause the separation, because we can still appeal to those basic notions as the thing. So yeah, the arguments against that are that it does seem to render all of those notions ambiguous. But I think more to the point is that this is the argument from the paper, which is if we are traveling, it's a problem for minimalists, like that the creeping minimalism is a problem. If you are a minimalist about these notions, then you have a hard time distinguishing these two things. And if you're a minimalist about truth, your view is not that there are two different kinds of truth, one minimal, one non-minimal. Your view is that truth is a very simple, minimalistically understood notion. So the bifurcation strategy is not really open to minimalists. It might be open to other theorists who are happy with it, but that's just to say, if you think minimalism is not true, then for you the problem of creeping minimalism doesn't really arise. So it's to be unclear who the bifurcation strategy is for. If it's for people who are not minimalists, it would have to be for people who aren't minimalists, because bifurcating everything is not being minimal about it whatsoever. So if it's for them, they don't really need to bifurcate because they're not minimalists in the first place. But if you are a minimalist, you can't bifurcate, because now that gives up your minimalism. So that's why I see dialectically, it's not engaging with the issue in the right way. Right.
Yeah. But one thing I thought was really interesting with this paper is that truth making is a notion that is met with quite a lot of skepticism from minimalists or those in that camp. Thinking here, maybe Hugh Price or Amy Thomason. And I was wondering if it is open to them. I mean, supposing you're right that truth making is the best way to characterize this dispute between realism and anti-realism, or maybe quasi-realism and robust realism. Could they dialectically grant truth makers as a way to kind of solve this dispute, or would it be? Even if they could consistently adopt the notion, would it fit with their philosophical worldview, so to speak? Yeah, so I a lot to say about this. And it comes out in a more recent paper of mine called the best thing about the deflationary theory of truth. I tackle people like Price and Thomason directly. So a long-standing view of mine, which probably I don't know that it comes out in the Creeping Minimalism paper, but the bigger thesis of my work around that time was that there's a lot of value in separating the two philosophical projects of giving a theory of truth and giving a theory of truth makers. So it's I go to lengths to say, well, what we're doing when we're giving a theory of truth makers is we're not giving a theory of truth. So earlier when I talked about what the project of truth making is, it was all focused on the metaphysics. Here's when you have a domain of truths, you're asking ontological questions about what goes along, metaphysically speaking, with those truths. It's not about a theory of giving an account of what it is to be true or anything like that. So fundamentally, I think to give a theory of truth makers is a logically and conceptually independent project from giving a theory of the nature of truth. Two separate projects. Therefore, being a truth maker theorist is not at all is not a contrasting view or an oppositional view to being a deflationist or minimalist about truth. They're engaged in different projects. So one thing I've been at pains to argue for is to avoid a certain kind of what I think is a bad argument, an argument that says something like, truth is best understood in this minimalist deflationary way. Therefore, we don't need this metaphysically robust understanding of truth to understand what truth is.
Therefore, there's no need to take this talk of truthmaker theory seriously.
Mm.
So I think that's an invalid argument. I think that jump to truth making presupposes that truthmaker theory is in the business of getting a metaphysically substantive theory of truth itself. So I think my favorite, but I think the clearest way to show why that argument doesn't work is to think about somebody like David Lewis.
Mm.
So no one should take lightly the thought that David Lewis's overall perspective on philosophy is just like easily contradicted and logically incoherent. But here's two things that David Lewis believes. He argued for being a kind of minimalist or deflationist about truth. He has a paper called Forget About the Correspondence Theory of Truth. So I think he's totally happy to endorse a basically deflationist perspective on truth. On the other hand, who is a better paradigm realist about something than David Lewis about possible worlds? David Lewis is a modal realist, a concrete modal realist. He thinks that other possible worlds are like just as real as the actual world. They exist in a way, spatio-temporally isolated from us, but they are just as real as is the actual world. Now, so here's what we have. We have a person who's a deflationist about truth and has at the same time taken on what I take to be the most committed metaphysical position one can really take on. Like there's no ontological commitment bigger and stronger than concrete modal realism. and notice how whether he's a deflationist or a correspondence theorist has absolutely nothing to do with that. So the way I put it is Lewis is a realist about possible worlds because he thinks that there are infinitely many concrete possible worlds. And he thinks that in taking on that commitment, he's committing himself to the existence of all those infinitely many actual concrete possible worlds. It has nothing to do with the fact that he disagrees that the sentence, there's an infinity of concrete possible worlds, corresponds to some fact in the world. Like he doesn't need a correspondence relation. What he needs is, I believe it's true that there are infinitely many concrete possible worlds. And what makes that claim true are all the infinitely many concrete possible worlds. That's why he's a realist. It's not because he's a correspondence theorist about truth. It's because he actually commits himself to the reality of all these things that are there, which is why he thinks it's true that he thinks the worlds exist, and that's what makes it true. So this is only I think a basic illustration of how, look, what makes you a realist is not like what you think your sentences correspond. It's not your theory of truth. You can be a deflationist. It's what your ontological commitments are that you take on to support your metaphysics, the things that you take to be true about reality. So I use Lewis here as an example of why it's an invalid inference to say if you're a deflationist about truth, you thereby cannot take on metaphysical positions.
Right. Yeah. No. I completely get that. I was kind of that was the reason I was asking. Maybe it's consistent to have those two aims, giving kind of a broad semantic deflationism. Maybe it kind of doesn't sit very well. I was thinking here because in your paper you describe truth makers as a sort of an explanation for the truth of a given sentence. So the explanation for the truth of murder is wrong, maybe moral facts of a certain kind. But I think maybe pragmatists like Hugh Price would then say that such explanations are not warranted or called for in some way. The only explanation as to why Snow is white is true is whatever is going to make snow white, and that's like a chemical physical story. So that the kind of driver for it is maybe not deflationism about truth, but maybe deflationism about semantics in some way, that there cannot be we don't need any kind of explanations for semantic phenomena like truth in any kind of robust way. I was thinking that might be, I thought that was the reason why your paper was interesting, because that's kind of goes against what the people kind of driving creeping minimalism believe. But I was wondering if you could say something about that that sort of skepticism towards truth makers?
Yeah, I have a hypothesis that I think I might know exactly where the disagreement between me and someone like Price shows up. It's just a hypothesis, but in the paper, so the solution I offer to the creeping minimalism problem is basically saying, look, realism debates, wherever they're found, should be ultimately understood as debates about reality, hence their name, realism. So I think the best way to find the differences is to look to the metaphysics. What are the metaphysical positions that these different views are offering? And then, so what I do is, so I think it's with the realist side, the various kinds of realists, I think they're pretty straightforward as to what they think the ontological grounds are for moral truths. So then you go over to like the quasi-realist expressivist side, and I focus in on people like Simon Blackburn here. Yeah. So on the one hand, you might think the quasi-realists, that's when they say that's where you've gone wrong. Like, what do you mean metaphysical grounds for ethical statements? Like that's what I'm trying to reject, right? And then I say, but hold on a second. Let's look at your actual writings. What do you actually say? And what do you say is you say ethical statements and judgments require grounds. Yeah. So an example that Blackburn gives is he says, okay, suppose you are evaluating two term papers differently. This one gets an A, this one gets a B. If you're going to make that judgment, you better have some grounds for making that judgment. Here's why the A paper is better than the B paper. You can't just say, oh, they're exactly the same. In fact, they are literally exactly the same paper, but this one gets an A and this one gets a B. You've made some kind of mistake there if you've done that. You've said, I'm going to make this judgment, this evaluation between these two things, and yet I'm doing it on no basis whatsoever. Similarly, so you can do the same thing with more specifically ethical avowals. So Blackburn gives the example of like kicking dogs for fun is cruel. Like, and you can say, well, why is that? And the obvious answer seems to be, well, at least that's a first pass. The reason it's wrong to kick things for fun is that it causes them pain. Yeah, for no benefit. That is, that's a perfectly naturalistic fact that this kind of action causes pain in this kind of creature, and that's the basis for the moral judgment, presumably. Like, you think it. So what I do is I go through Blackburn's work and I say, here's all these claims where he seems to be making truth-making claims. It's wrong to do this in virtue of this. It's wrong to do this because of this, and he posits like some naturalistic fact about the world that is the grounds for the ethical statement. Now, so here's what I see going on here. I see like we have a sentence like torture is wrong. And you can ask the question, well, what makes torture wrong? And I think if you're answering that question, you're offering a truth-making account. You're offering a truth maker for the claim that torture is wrong. Okay, yeah. But I think the reason like Blackburn thinks he's not doing truth maker theory, and I think what people like Price think is something like, well, I think this is what they think truth maker theory is. Science comes along and science tells us why snow is white and why that's what science does. And then the pesky metaphysicians come along and say, but why is snow is white true? What's its truth maker? But that's silly. Science told us what snow is white is. Science told us why snow is white. Now we're deflationists about truth. So there is no further question about what makes it true that snow is white. Yeah. But I feel like that's just misunderstanding the whole project. If you tell me why snow is white, you just told me what the truth maker is, presumably for snow being white. If you've given me an account of why it's true of why snow is white, because deflationism is true in some sense. Yeah. You've given me an account for why it's true that snow is white. So I charge Price and Thomason with like being there's kind of irony here, I think. Yeah. I think like to the extent we're all deflationists here, we should agree that like talking about P and talking about it's true that P is talking about the same thing. And yet they see a separation between asking the question, what makes it true that P, or what makes it the case that P, and what makes it true that P. They want to see those questions as different. One is bad metaphysics and the other is like good science. But I feel like their deflationism should make them stop doing that. The question, what makes it true that snow is white, just is the question, what makes snow white? So I think what they're doing is they're where I think all the interesting truth-making questions are being asked and answered. They think that's not metaphysics, that's science. And then where the metaphysics steps in, that's all superfluous. I think what they've done is basically said, yeah, I will accept the truth-making story that the scientists give us for these domains. And it's like, great, that's what we all think, right? Like, the view is not that only philosophers have the last say on what exists in reality. That's not what anybody's view is. So I think the project that people like Price are criticizing is, I think, not the actual truth-making project.
Right.
And I think it just there's more to be said, of course, on this topic, but I feel like, they've sort of they think all the truth-making questions are kind of easily settled. And I think truth-maker theorists think of themselves as going on some other like further project after all the initial explanatory work is done, but that's not really what we're up to.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because I remember from the other paper you mentioned, the best thing about the deflationary theory of truth, you say that Price and Thomason are kind of maximalists rather than minimalists about notions of truth making or robust truth, whereas that's kind of odd given their other like minimalism in other areas. Like, why not be just a deflationist about truth making as well? So that in the way that you've described. But is that the kind of view you have about truth making, that it's not really kind of it's not a spooky, is that a good word, enterprise, but it's rather just kind of it's continuous with science in some way, or continuous with first order inquiry.
I mean, this is the ancient debate about metaphysics. I think just gets gets recycled every generation. Right? Like, is if you're writing in the 1930s, by definition, I've been teaching air this semester. If by definition to be a metaphysical claim is to be like some claim that stands outside possible experience, then if you have views about scientific ontology, then metaphysics by definition is going to be a bunch of meaningless garbage. And so I worry that Thomason and Price are going back to that. It's like they're saying like science is fine, but anytime you start to do like metaphysics on top of science, then you're doing bad work. But that's to say, like, the word metaphysics is something that can't appear, metaphysical ideas can't appear in the sciences, and I just see no basis for that. I feel like science makes metaphysical and ontological discoveries all the time. We've learned quite recently that there's more species of giraffes than we thought. Like, that's an ontological discovery. The fact that biologists make it doesn't make it not metaphysics. And so I mean, I see, I don't know if continuity is the right way, but, as I put it at the very beginning, like, I see metaphysics as just this sort of indispensable thing that exists everywhere. Like, I feel like, I mean, one way I would put it is I don't think the sciences are metaphysically agnostic. And I think sometimes, like, I think the sciences are and like, just ordinary, boring empirical observation is thoroughly in the business of discovering what exists. And I don't think, so I don't think, I think, ontology is committed to all over the place, all the time. It's not something that happens like after science is done and now the philosophers get to work. I think that's the wrong picture of how it all fits together.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting. Okay, so that's some kind of meta stuff. But let's get back to the essay, because I think what you said before was that Blackburn's calling out for grounds or explanations in ethics, and he's a quasi-realist. So roughly, what that means is that he's an expressivist plus this minimalist stuff. So he thinks that ethical sentences can be true, even though they're merely expressions of some attitude. They can express facts and so on. So what the question is then, like, what is then the difference between a robust realist and a quasi-realist? And what you say is that the difference between them is that the quasi-realist, with regard the relationship of truth making between a reason for a particular moral judgment, like in the discourse of morality, and the moral claim as projected upon the world, whereas a robust realist would regard that relationship as sort of an objective form of truth making. Is that a good way of formulating what you kind of claim?
It's a good way of articulating what I said in the paper.
Yeah,
and I feel like,
have you changed your mind now, or?
I don't know if I've changed my mind, in the sense of I think this is the biggest IOU in the paper. So this is the stage of the paper where, like, I take it the original creeping minimalism problem was something like, what separates your Simon Blackburn quasi-realist from like your ultra non-naturalistic realist, like a G.E. Moore or a Russ Schaefer Landau.
Right.
Because they both want to say that moral claims are objectively true. And then the idea is quasi-realists can say that so long as they're minimalist about truth. But I think that contrast is pretty easy, because if you look at like what people like G.E. Moore think are the truth makers for moral claims, they think it's like there are like non-naturalistic ethical properties that belong to the world alongside all the other ones. Like, I think they've got these basic properties that exist in the world that are not reducible to anything naturalistic. And because they're there, they constitute a normative realm of reality just alongside the non-normative realm. So I think they've got a very clear ontological commitment there that they're happy to subscribe to, that a quasi-realist is going to say, no way, I didn't.
Yeah.
So like that distinction, I think, is easy. Like, that's a very clear disagreement about what exists in their ontology in order to explain why ethical judgments are true. And so, because I don't think truth making can be minimalized, I think it avoids the creeping minimalism problem. I've got other papers about why it's incoherent to talk about being a minimalist about truth making. It's like saying I'm going to be ontologically serious about something without ontology. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. Be a minimalist about truth all you want, but minimalism about truth making is just incoherent. So I think that's part of why it dodges the problem. So in the paper, where I think like for me, the big pressure becomes, how do we separate the quasi-realist from the naturalistic moral realists, the ones who think ethical grounds, you think ethical judgments are true. They're true in virtue of naturalistic facts, and different naturalists will give different accounts. So there's a sense in which the naturalistic realist and the quasi-realist are big picture ontologically similar. They think like all the facts in the world fundamentally are all naturalistic. There isn't this special normative realm of facts that the G.E. Moore types believe in. Yeah. So there is this actual metaphysical alignment between a quasi-realist and the naturalistic realist, such that I think when you ask them what are the truth makers for moral judgments, they might point to one and the same fact or the same stuff in the world. It's all the stuff. It's all the stuff going on in the brains of the dogs that causes them to feel pain when they get kicked. Like that's the same stuff that maybe everybody can agree on these two camps is what makes it true. Then that it's wrong to kick the dogs. So what I say in the paper is, okay, so the truth makers seem to be potentially the same. So how do we now distinguish the whole creeping minimalism problems? How do we distinguish between these views? Aren't I now saying that there's no way to distinguish between the quasi-realist and the naturalistic realist? So then the move that gets made in the paper is something like, well, it's not that they disagree about what the truth makers are. It's something about the nature of the truth making relation that obtains. Yeah. And maybe that's to be spelled out differently. But I don't think I don't say much in the paper to really spell out what that actually comes to. Is there like a kind of normal truth making, and then there's relation, and then there's this like more projectivist truth making relation? And I think you got to be very careful, because what you don't want to say is, in the quasi-realist sense, like the natural stuff makes true the ethical judgment only if like this other thing exists, like my sentiment or something like that. You don't want to build this. You don't want to build the sentiments into the truth makers, because that just turns your view into subjectivism. Like the subjectivist thinks your sentiments, your attitudes are the things that make the ethical judgments true. Quasi-realists don't want to say that. They don't want to say, it's not because I don't like this stuff that this stuff is wrong. This stuff is wrong because it's wrong, because it does these things out there in the world. That's why it's wrong. It has nothing to do with me. So if you want to preserve that element to quasi-realism, you can't build the sentiments into the truth-making picture.
Right.
The truths cannot depend on the existence of your sentiments. Well, then, what is the difference? So I was forced to come to a reckoning with this in when doing like a book symposium last year. And so it was an invitation for me to think through this question again. And so I don't want to say that the truth-making relation should be understood differently for the quasi-realists. They should still say, look, whatever Asay says about the truth-making relation in these other cases, it's the same truth-making relation here. So, but one thing I say, I don't know if this is going to be an ultimately satisfying account, but it's something like, well, here's what the quasi-realists should think about this. They should think, when I'm making a claim about moral truth makers, I'm still in the realm of ethical thought. So the quasi-realist thinks like, whatever their view is, it's something like, you're doing something different when you're engaged in evaluations. You're not just straightforwardly describing the world, you are evaluating, you're making judgments about it. And that's a different cognitive space to be in. I think Blackburn articulates it in functionalist terms, like what it is to be engaged in ethical thought has a functional profile that's different from what it is to be engaged in like naturalistic descriptive thought. And so what I want to focus on here is to say, well, I think what the quasi-realists should think is like, when they're making these claims about moral truth makers, which I think they do, they should say, well, when I'm making these claims, I'm still in evaluative mode. When I say kicking dogs is wrong in virtue of the pain that's caused to them in so doing, that claim right there is still in the realm of ethical evaluative judgments. So it's the same truth-making relation, as it were. You still are, when you're making that judgment, you're still saying the modality lines up between these two things in the right way, such that any world with all the pain stuff is going to be a world where it's bad. But I think that claim itself is not, it's just as ethical of a judgment, as it were, as it is to say this is wrong. I isolate a passage from Blackburn's 1998 book where he says something like, he uses that language of the open question. It's always an open question what the grounds are for any particular ethical judgment. And I want to say that's kind of getting at what I'm grasping at here. It's that when the quasi-realist makes a judgment, like this moral claim is true in virtue of these naturalistic facts, not those naturalistic facts, it's these ones. That itself is an evaluation. You're in the evaluative mode, linking up these things in the world with moral judgments about it. And I think the naturalistic realist has a different perspective on that. They think that it's a kind of a closed question, really. Like, these are the naturalistic facts, and these are the moral judgments, and they line up. Right. And you're not, that's a claim about like just the nature of these properties, and it's just you as the evaluator doesn't enter into this picture at all. Right. So this is an all way of trying to say, in what sense, for quasi-realists, the ethical judgments depend on us. What does that really come to? And what's got to be clear is that there's no ontological dependence in terms of like, they don't depend on us. That's not what we're doing when we make moral judgments. It's not saying it metaphysically depends on us. The dependence has got to be some other kind. And I take it the challenge and project of quasi-realism is to articulate what exactly that is. What is that notion of dependence?
Yeah.
I think thinking about truth makers makes it clear it shouldn't be ontological dependence. It's not that. These things don't ontologically depend on our sentiments.
Mm.
And so my first pass of trying to say, like, what is the difference between the naturalistic realist and the quasi-realist is to look at, like, well, the truth-making claims themselves, I think they might disagree as to whether they themselves are further ethical claims.
Mm.
Are they still in the bounds, the realm of the ethical and the normative? Whereas they shouldn't be if you're a naturalistic realist, because then you're just kind of tracing out the ultimate metaphysical dependencies between goodness and pain and stuff like that. But like those, so yeah, I mean, I don't want. It's an unsatisfying.
Yeah, no, I don't want to push you too hard on that. On that, given that it's a view in development and so on. But like, I was wondering when I read the paper as to whether this creeping minimalism problem may be kind of in principle insoluble, because one of the motivations for quasi-realism is that in first order ethical inquiry or discourse, we view kind of statements that describe the import of subjectivity or evaluation as kind of retracting our statement. So if I say murdering babies is wrong, and then I go on to say, well, that's just, my evaluation of the world, it's not the world, then that looks like I'm kind of retracting what I said. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering here if either your views as described in the paper of this projected truth-making relation, or admitting that the truth-making relation is projected, or the way you describe here that I'm kind of in an evaluative mood when I'm describing the truth makers of ethical sentences and so on, that this, someone would say, well, this is actually just this goes against first order ethical practice where we should retract what we were saying. Do you see what I mean? That a good quasi-realist would never admit that they're a quasi-realist in practice, because that would just be kind of retracting what they say. So you can't, we have to be quiet about this matter, because there's just nothing we could say that wouldn't kind of infringe on the first order. Do you see what I mean? Like,
what I think, like, the stuff that evaluative mood stuff, I think is a doubling down on that as a way of responding to this kind of challenge, I think. And by trying to do channel my inner Simon Blackburn here as best as possible. Yeah. I think I think the quasi-realist says, like, I do want to be like, and I do want to be able to assert my quasi-realism. And I think that there's maybe an important dimension to the creeping minimalism problem that we haven't made explicit, which is this quasi-realism as an idea. Like, the quasi-realist, the whole point of the view is to sound as realist as possible without being a realist. Yeah. So creeping minimalism is a distinctive problem for quasi-realists, I think, because of the nature of what the quasi-realist is after. They want to mimic the realist, and their program is more successful the more they can mimic the realist. But there still has to be, they can't literally mimic every last claim. Like, if literally their commitments as to what's true is literally one for one the same exactly down the road, then they are not different. There has to be at least one thesis that they disagree about if they are going to be separate views. So quasi-realism on the one hand is more successful the more it can mimic realism, but there's got to be at least one thesis where it doesn't mimic it. Otherwise, they are indistinguishable. All right. So my view is about where that one thesis ought to be. So I think I think how the quasi-realist would respond to what you were saying just now is they're going to say, look, I am a quasi-realist, and they'll say things like, these naturalistic facts, they are the truth makers. These facts about the paper, about the essays, these facts about the essays that we can all point to and empirically verify, these are the things that are responsible for for the grades that I gave.
Yeah.
And if they had been different, I would have given different grades. And if I had given them the same grade, I would not have had to, I would have found no basis within the papers to do that. And you keep saying these things, and you go, but aren't you a quasi-realist? And you go, well, sure, I'm a quasi-realist. But by the way, here are the grounds for, and because these grounds exist in every possible world with these, where the papers look like this, I'm going to give them a different grade. And the grades depend on these naturalistic facts about the papers themselves. And they're going to say, look, when I say all these things, I'm not conceding anything. I've made no mention about me. They're saying I want to push, my own internal struggle is, are these things that I think about, are they objections for quasi-realism, or are they helpful things for quasi-realism?
Yeah.
Because I have this instinct of like, does the quasi-realist, they kind of step back. You want to say to the quasi-realist, yes. You're talking first order, great. But let's step back for a second and be metaethicists and say, when you're making these truth-making judgments about these natural facts make true the ethical facts, like right? When we're stepping back and talking about that, aren't you just doing that because of who you are? But I think they got to say, look, I mean, whatever evaluative projectivist mode you're in, when you're saying that's wrong, that's good, let's do that, let's not do that, you're still in that mode when you step back and start to reflect and be a metaethicist. You're not stepping out of the normative realm when you step into metaethics mode. And so as long as you don't concede at any point that there's like an ontological dependence between your sentiments and the moral judgments,
right.
So I get the pull that it is like, you want to be like, yes, you think you're still doing ethics, but let's step back and talk and think, but aren't you still at some level conceding that you are important here? But they always grant that, we are an important element here. We are the ones that are gilding and staining reality with these moral features. But part of the view is the gilding and the staining is not what makes it true that they have these features. I think that's hard. It is hard to account for.
It's very hard to account for. Yeah, it's very interesting at the very least. Okay, so I wanted to ask you one more question before we wrap this up. So just talking about like where your views are right now. You write in the paper that you think that quasi-realism kind of best accounts for the status of ethics. Do you still kind of, is that a view you still hold, or do you think you would have written the paper differently if you did it today?
Yeah, I think I'm still fundamentally sympathetic with that. As I was saying before, like when I was first thinking about this, I first saw an objection to quasi-realism here. Similar to what I say in the paper, where I talk about these counterfactual views, constructivist views, where I say, like, look, you haven't answered the truth-making question. You've told me if this ethical judgment is true, then you've told me this counterfactual is true. Like a set of ideal judges would approve of this action or something like that. Like, that's great, but that's just another truth. Tell me what the truth maker is. I need to know what the metaphysics is before I know whether you're a realist or not. So I think my thinking initially was quasi-realists have just like not answered the metaphysical question. They need to answer the truth-making question. What makes these moral judgments true? If they haven't done it, then they haven't really justified that they're a non-realist position. But then I dug into it and I was like, actually, I think they are. At least Blackburn seems to be making all kinds of truth-making claims all over the place. And so maybe actually quasi-realists have a good answer to these truth-making claims. So I think like the general weighting that I offer in the paper, I think I'm still very sympathetic to, which is that when it comes to like the metaphysics of morals, the non-naturalistic realists, I think, have not a great story. Because it requires this ontology of purely non-reducible, purely normative dimension to reality. So and I think Blackburn's argument going back to the 70s about that view has a hard time making sense of why our ethical judgments do supervene on the natural world.
Yeah.
I think there's a kind of truth-making intuition there too, which is like, well, like if you think the two papers deserve different grades, even if you're a moral realist and you think there are these like moral properties out there, looks like the moral properties still line up with the natural properties in the right way. Like if the moral properties shouldn't be shifting around, if the physical properties aren't shifting around also. If not, then it's like there's kind of a weird thing where like the truth about these moral judgments can change, even though the ethical or the non-ethical stuff doesn't change. So I think Blackburn's original supervenience argument, I think, is a close neighbor to a truth-making style of argument that says like it does seem like the ethical facts depend on the non-ethical facts. That's hard to explain if the non-ethical and the ethical are just like two totally metaphysically distinct domains.
Right.
So that makes me still sympathetic to rejecting the non-naturalistic truth-making story for ethical judgments. So then the question then it's like, well, you can go like old school non-cognitivist and reject ethical truth altogether. You can buy into some kind of relativist or subjectivist view, but I think that gets the truth-making story wrong as well.
Right.
I mean, I guess haven't argued against relativism or subjectivism per se, but I'm signed up with everybody else. But sympathetic for not thinking those are the best explanations of moral truth. So then you end up with the quasi-realist and the naturalistic realist. And then here I think there's the projectivist, expressivist, quasi-realist get something right about the open-endedness of ethical investigation, which I think is again reflected here. Like even when you're doing truth maker theory about ethics, that openness is still there. Like I'm still when I point to these facts about nature that explain my moral judgment, I'm still in ethical evaluative mode. And there's like no further, no Putnam twin earth example or anything is gonna like uncover, oh, really, it was these set of naturalistic facts that show us what goodness really has been all along. I think like something about ethical investigation, the reason that we can't just like determinately figure out that goodness actually naturalistically reduces down to all this stuff. I think there's reasons why that can't happen. And I think the quasi-realist spin on things captures that fact about ethical practice a little bit better. So short answer is I'm very still broadly sympathetic that quasi-realism seems to be like in the best metaethical view is at least with respect to the metaphysics of morals.
Right, cool. Well, I thank you very much for this open-ended discussion, and go and read the paper if you're interested in it. So, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.